Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and I wanted first of all to say thank you so much for all the new subscribers. You guys are awesome. Thank you. I feel like the channel is just growing by leaps and bounds. You have no idea how happy that makes me that people are enjoying this content. But one thing I've noticed with so many new people and new faces around is that I get comments about books that I should consider doing for the channel. And many times they're books that I've actually already covered. And I thought maybe people just aren't aware of the playlists that are available. So at the end of this video, I'm going to be announcing our new read, but until this Sunday, when I plan on starting that new read, maybe there's a book from the channel you haven't listened to yet or didn't know that I had already covered. And I thought it might be helpful just to do a very brief rundown of the books that I've done. And then at the end of the video, we'll talk about what we're reading next. Thank you to all the people who voted on Instagram and also in the community tab sounded off about what you wanted to hear. I was surprised, honestly, about the book that most people wanted, but very pleasantly surprised because it was what I had hoped for too. The first book that I ever read on this channel 2 years ago was Spare. And I chose that book because everybody was reading about the dog bowl incident. And that was like the only excerpt we were getting. And I thought to myself, this nut who has decided to share this experience he had with his brother that was so outlandish, that I thought if he's going to try to tell that narrative, if that's the level that he has sunk to, this whole book's going to be a gold mine. And let me tell you, it was. Us reading it together was just hilarious. It was definitely the funniest book I've ever read. It was hands down one of the most entertaining reads I have ever done. And it was amazing. And then after Spare, we were just so sickened by that narrative that we were desperately needing a palate cleanse. And so then we turned to Revenge because we wanted to hear Tom Bower's explanation of how Megan came into the family and all of her motivations. Excellent read. I mean, I think that probably of the two books, people loved Spare, but Revenge, I think, was really where people sunk their teeth into it and really were enjoying it. And I think that if you have not gone back to watch Revenge, or you didn't know that I'd covered Revenge, I would highly recommend that playlist. It was so insightful, so interesting. Tom Bower was a great writer. He kept the story moving. It was fabulous. But after I did 2 books on the royals, I realized I was becoming known as a royal book channel, and I didn't necessarily want that to be true. I don't mind talking about the royals, obviously, I talk about them all the time, but I also thought there's so many channels out there, and what I had intended was for the channel to be one in which I read biographies and memoirs and like just did these long form book reviews where we could laugh and have conversation, but I didn't want it to always be where I was having to fall back on the royal family, where it was always like a Meghan bashing. Because there's just so many channels already doing that. There's just so many other content creators on every other platform that's doing that. I thought, I don't want to be another voice in the darkness just barking about the same stupid thing. So then I tried to like switch it up, but I got kind of too aggressive with my switch up, and I was doing a book about Hunter S. Thompson from the view of his son. The audience wasn't ready for that one. So I didn't finish it because there just was zero interest in it. There was a loyal few who were enjoying it, but it just, on the whole, was such a time-consuming project for like 5 people to be excited about it. So then I did, let's see, what did I do after that? I don't know if I can remember in order all the books that I did. Oh, then I went back to The Watering Hole, and I decided, okay, I cannot talk about the modern royal family. I felt like I had talked about it from every single angle, but the one couple that I'd always wanted to talk about and always wanted to read about was Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. Obviously, that story is bonkers. Then I found out about Trader King by Andrew Lowney, and that book was amazing. Let me just tell you that as an author, he is top notch when it comes to digging for all the details that you've never heard before. Trader King was a phenomenal read. Let me talk to you about the revelations of that book. We're talking about a couple that was into some weird stuff together. We're talking about a man who had never come out of childhood. A man that was strange and babyish and desperately needing Wallis Simpson, almost like a mother. She was like this mean, harsh mistress. The way they spent their money, the way they did not pay their bills, the way that they were constantly mooching off of everybody. I entitled that series The Original Harry and Meghan because the similarities were shocking. This nobody American divorcee who shows up, gets involved with the royal family, and then pulls him away from his family. And then they go around trying to create a life that never quite gets off the ground. I mean, it was like, how prosaic. all Harry needed to do was look at his own family and learn the lessons that were there before he ever jumped into the bed with Meghan. But no. So that was a really interesting series. And if you haven't given that series a listen, I would highly recommend it. I think the other thing that was really interesting was how in bed Edward VIII was with the Nazi government and how many plans they had for his future should Germany take over England the way they all believed that they would. And Edward VIII was in full agreement that that's what should happen. And then he was hoping to be reinstated in the throne. You cannot even imagine the intricacies and the scheming and the plotting. But then even far apart from all the plotting and the scheming was just the total depravity of that couple. So highly recommend. And then after that, I decided to do some like silly little celebrity memoirs that I thought would be popular. I made an enormous blunder when I chose Worthy, the memoir by Jada Pinkett Smith. I cannot overstate how confused she was about her own story. The way she told her story was so fraudulent. It sounded so fake. I'm not saying that some of this stuff wasn't true, but the way, I mean, the vibrato and the the largesse of like her explanations about how she got where she is, and it's like she was just so overdramatic. It was as though a student from a high school creative writing clinic had been tasked with the job of writing the memoir of Jada Pinkett Smith. I mean, there was just so much overwhelming drama. So many scenes were overplayed, pretension. It was just the worst. Like, I finished the book, and what I mean by finished is that I got about halfway through reading it, dedicating every page to the camera. And about halfway through, I was like, no. I don't hate you guys. And if I keep going, you're going to think that I do. And so I basically skimmed the end, read you the highlights, told you kind of generally, her sob story, and then we were off. Like, we were done with that. But then right after that book came Britney Spears' memoir. And I feel like that one did not get all the attention that it should have because it was really interesting. But it was also weird because the first half was really interesting, but then the second half felt like she was sort of in a drug-induced coma when she wrote it. She started skipping over great swaths, not being as detailed, not being as honest. It was very much like everyone is wrong, man, I had nothing to do with it. Now, granted, I do think that she's been used and manipulated. I think we can agree she's not a completely well person. And I think that maybe some of her lapse in judgment is maybe the amount of medication that she's been on, some of her lapses in memory, some of it just seemed very skimmed over. So the last part was not as interesting, but the first half of it, when she's talking about her life and what the way her parents were with her and what she experienced with her mom, and her mom was like drinking with her and stuff like that, it was wild. I don't think I had realized just how objectified she was by the media, but also by her family, who were not fighting for her safety in any context. So that was really interesting. And it's especially interesting that, with the conservatorship and everything, it is though they were saying, oh, Britney is not a safe person to herself. But I thought, you guys haven't cared about her safety low these many years. I mean, they were throwing her to the wolves at the tender age of 17. So for them to suddenly hustle back and be like, she can't take care of herself. Y'all couldn't take care of her. So anyway, if you haven't listened to that and you're not looking for the hard-hitting historical biography, you can't do better than the Britney Spears memoir. It was juicy. It was interesting. I enjoyed that read. But then after that, I thought we should do something that was a little bit more elevated because I don't feel like everyone was loving the Jada Pinkett Smith. Not surprisingly, I hated it. But the Britney Spears book I thought would be more interesting. So then I thought, okay, maybe we just want to talk about the royal family again. But I wanted to talk about a character who I had heard about over and over and over and everything I've read about the 20th century. Lord Louis Mountbatten is constantly discussed. So then I read another book by Andrew Lowney entitled The Mountbattens, and it was about the life of Louis and his wife Edwina. And she was a nymphomaniac, and he was potentially not even straight. That book was crazy. But I would say a lot more dense. So if you are not looking for the history of the 20th century as told by the crazy lives of two people, that might not be the book for you. But if you do like well-documented, well-researched historical biographies, especially about a character who is so essential to one's understanding of the 20th century, then that would be a great read and a great book to listen to. But then I sort of felt like I needed to move away from this same family and potentially talk about something else. And at that same time, Ask Not, the book by Maureen Callahan about the Kennedy men, had just come out. Well, it was the perfect summer read. It was probably not new information, but it was told in a different way, as in it is a collection of stories in which these lauded and praised men are looked at in a different light, in the light that they were constantly exploiting the women in their lives. And it was a very eye-opening book, especially if you are a person who had, always looked at the Kennedy as saints. I don't know that there's that many people left over who do look at the Kennedys as saints, but their aura and mystery sort of hangs in the air. The idea that you could have a family that is that loved, though we may be more conscious that the individuals were not as lovable. But the fantasy of having that, American royalty, if you want to say. So the book was really eye-opening, the way she told the story. Maureen Callahan wrote the book as going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth throughout all the women, but I took each of their stories and then I made one episode or like 1 to 2 episodes about each woman. So we just got these little capsule stories about each woman. And it was interesting, especially if you didn't know very much about them. It was kind of a great way to sort of dip your toe into some of these stories. And the one person in that book that was not highlighted whatsoever was Ethel Kennedy. And I thought it was so strange because I had heard Ethel Kennedy was quite the character. And I thought that for Maureen Callahan to have skipped over such a juicy topic, what was going on with Ethel that Maureen didn't want to talk about? Well, probably because Ethel was no real victim of the Kennedys. I mean, she fully supported them. She was 100% behind everything that the Kennedys did. Even when she was given evidence that the Kennedys were out to lunch, she was like, nope, nope, nope. Everything we do is amazing and you should think so too. So that's when I started reading The Other Mrs. Kennedy, which was a book all about Ethel Kennedy. And I have to say, that's the book we just finished. It was amazing. Jerry Oppenheimer is an incredible biographer because he managed to get so many sources on the record. And so many people were just telling these crazy stories about life with Ethel, who I truly believe, and I got some pushback from this, but I truly believe she was suffering from mental illness. Because this is a person who, after her husband died, and she had so much tragedy. And if you haven't listened to that series, you guys stop this video and go watch that series. I mean, you will be floored. This is a person who came from so much money in her original family, in the Skakel family. And her father had gotten very rich very fast. And her mother was all about spending that money. Her mother was not about being a mom. Her mom was about traveling and going and doing her own thing and just, finding random people to watch her kids. The house was always a mess. There was always mayhem, mischief, pranks. Like, Ethel Kennedy grew up in an absolute circus. And then when she got married, she became her own ringleader and she had her own circus. And I think that she really just suffered from a complete breakdown, though she did not admit it, and nobody in the circle seemed like they were willing to admit it. She was a rageaholic. She was abusive to the staff. She had no concept of keeping a home. Tons of animals and pets just defecating and urinating all over everything. The house was filthy and threadbare. People who came over were shocked at the state of the house. Her kids were running wild. She seemed very incapable of mothering this many kids. And granted, 11 kids is a ton of kids to parent, but she was super proud in having birthed them, but did not know what to do with them once they were in this world. She all but drove Bobby and David out of the house with a whip. I mean, she had people who were their guardians who were just as depraved as the boys were becoming, and who were introducing them to lifestyles and to habits that were going to lead them all down all kinds of destructive paths. And Ethel was just like, la la land. I mean, it was the craziest book. Oh, and then there was, completely forgot about this book. There was a book that I read. It was really short. I read it over the summer before Ask Not. I forgot about this one. It's called The Housekeeper's Diary. And it was about Diana and Charles and the breakdown of their relationship as told from the housekeeper at Highgrove. And she's very fair about what both of them were experiencing and very honest. And the book was actually banned in England. And she really suffered having told the truth. But the book is not, I don't feel like, an offensive portrait of really either character, although Diana does not come off well. But it's not as though she's trying to come after Diana. She's just telling what she saw. She's not editorializing on what she experienced. She's just telling literally what the experience was as Diana crept around corners and tried to listen to staff and try to trap people into saying things, holding things over people's heads, blackmailing people, completely losing it on the women who were there to help her and to dress her and to make sure that she was set up, discuss the bulimia and all the realities of that. And it was a super, super intimate and interesting discussion about what it was to be in the actual house with Charles and Diana, and what it was like to be a member of that staff, and what it was like to be constantly sort of used and abused under Diana, and what sort of boss Charles was. And it was just very, very interesting. I would highly recommend that one too if you're interested in any royal history. So I think that those are probably the top reads. Also on the channel, we've covered other things. Like we talked about the Harry and Meghan Netflix documentary. There's a whole series on that. When there was the Netflix documentary, Quiet on Set, about the Nickelodeon kids, I covered that. When Baby Reindeer came out, we talked about that. So there's all kinds of stuff on the channel. If you're looking for something to listen to and you're just not quite sure, there's playlists for everything. So, you can just go and binge a book. There's playlists for the docuseries that I've covered. So go and play around and see what you would like to listen to until Sunday when we start our new book. But I will say that if I had to choose 2 favorite books from the channel, that's hard. Well, I would say that if I had to choose 2, if there was a gun to my head, I would say that for any of the Royal Watchers, Revenge is a must listen. It is a must listen. We had so much fun with that book. It was fabulous. And then if you are like, I can't hear any more about Meghan, I hear you. I would say that if you haven't had the pleasure of listening to the Ethel Kennedy book by Jerry Oppenheimer, do yourself a favor and start the entertainment now. That every single episode was like the season finale of your favorite show. I mean, it was just like every chapter was just like bringing the crazy, like you wouldn't believe. Like I could not have anticipated where this story went. I couldn't have guessed in my wildest dreams where that story was going. And the fact that not more people have talked about Ethel Kennedy is just crazy to me. Her background as a Skakel before she ever became a Kennedy was equally, if not more interesting than all the stuff that happened to her as a Kennedy. And the Skakel family is crazy, and throughout the entire book, they're popping up with their crazy. It was phenomenal. So if you're looking for something to binge listen to, Revenge all the way, or The Other Mrs. Kennedy. Okay, so that's what you can listen to until Sunday, but what are we going to start with on Sunday? You guys, it's interesting because the voting on Instagram and then the voting on YouTube was pretty different. Everybody on Instagram, I would say that it was like 60-40 to the Palace Papers, but there were fewer votes. And then on YouTube, everybody wanted the book about Margaret Trudeau. That she wrote her own book, the story that she wrote. And, this is Justin Trudeau's mother. But what is so interesting about Margaret is that she wrote this book in the 70s, absolute wild child that made no apologies for it. And on YouTube, that's the book everyone wanted, and there were more votes there. So we're going to read that one first. It's a thin book, so then after that we'll read the Palace Papers. So everyone's going to be happy. But the first book we're going to read is Margaret's story. Margaret did not care what anybody thought. She was going to live her life. She was a wild child, and she made no apologies for it. And if you had a problem with it, that was that was like a you problem. You were the one that was stuck back in the Dark Ages. And she was going to do her thing and tell you about it. And she's not holding back. And I think that what I find so interesting about her story, as a juxtaposition to Ethel Kennedy's story, is that Ethel was also living her own life. Yes, she was doing things that made her look like the traditional wife, having lots of children, being faithful to the church, standing by your man. But in reality, she was wild and crazy, but she never seemed to want to take any kind of heat for being wild and crazy. She would play all these wild pranks and have people over to the house, pour drinks on their heads and push them into pools and act crazy. But then she'd get really angry if anybody noticed or if anybody wanted to criticize her in any way. Margaret's like, you don't criticize me. I'm going to live my life and this is how it's going to be. So she is very bold and very much like, this is my life and I'm going to tell you about it. And I don't have to shroud the details because I'm happy about the way things turned out. So we're going to read Margaret's story first, but then after that, we'll read the Palace Papers. And I think that that'll probably be pretty interesting too. Of course, the book that I'm really waiting for is Lowney's book about Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. That's the book we all want. But we got to do something with our time until then. If that book happens to come out before the Palace Papers, I'm going to read that book first. But the Palace Papers will always be there. So that's where we're going to go with the channel. And of course, nothing's happening to my Friday news roundup. I love that so much. It's so much fun. And, as we're reading, of course, I'll be putting out videos about whatever catches my fancy because those videos are just fun to make. The bread and butter of this channel has always been about books and reading together and talking about the different characters and their motivations and why people do what they do. The books aren't going anywhere, even if you do see that I'm doing more social commentary as well. Thanks to everyone who has become a new subscriber, and I hope this rundown gave you a little something to watch and to listen to while we wait for our new book on Sunday. I'll see you guys later this week, definitely on Friday, and we'll talk then. Bye.